Welcome to Charts Today. My name is David Linton, and today's edition for Wednesday, the 19th of December, comes to you from London. And we had US stock markets rising a little bit overnight, and that's filtered through to an improvement in sentiment in most markets. Looking at the dollar index, we're seeing that down slightly this morning. So, dollar is short-term bearish, but we still do have lots of upside targets, and the medium and long-term picture is still pretty bullish. The euro looking stronger on that weaker dollar, but again, we've got downside targets here hanging over the euro. So this is likely to be short-lived. The yen, we're seeing the dollar weakening against the yen is where it tends to show up first. So any improvement in the dollar, we'll see it probably in this chart before any other. And if we look at sterling, up on that weaker dollar this morning, not looking strong still on the medium and long-term charts, and still these big downside targets. If we look at the euro against sterling, we're weaker here as well. Market's really waiting for a decision from the Federal Reserve today as to whether we'll see interest rates go up or not. The chances of a rate hike today have reduced somewhat, and the market is now fairly mixed about whether we will see a rate rise or not. But of course, that is having a knock-on effect on quite a lot of currencies, and we should see a bit of volatility returning. We've also got industrial numbers out in Europe this morning, and we're also likely to see the European Commission publish their plans for no-deal Brexit. So expect to see some gyrations in the currencies today around that. Sterling against the Aussie dollar looking a bit better, and against the Swiss franc also looking quite strong on the short-term chart. Bitcoin up 1.3%, so their short-term uptrend continues, but it's against a very big headwind on the medium and long-term charts. As we see here, we're still pretty bearish. In the US, we mentioned the S&P 500 index was actually up very slightly, so a slight rise at the moment is fairly bullish given the backdrop we've seen. We've been seeing 14, 15-month lows, so that has really weighed heavily on sentiment. And the Nasdaq looking pretty flat as well. The Dow was up 1/3%, so that's looking a little bit better. And the broader based Russell 2000 index continues to sink to new lows. And from a market breadth perspective, we're seeing that long-term trend broken. So that is worrying for US stock markets. The futures up this morning 2/3% on the S&P future. The Nasdaq E-mini is up 0.6%, so it does suggest that US markets will open higher today. Looking at the FTSE 100 in the UK, we're up just under 1/4% this morning, but that's really little consolation given the bearish nature of the weekly, the daily, and the 60-minute chart. So we're seeing long-term bearish, medium-term bearish, short-term bearish. It's a pretty bearish picture generally. Looking at mid-caps, we're actually down slightly this morning. So again, very clearly bearish here with this big downside target of 20% on mid-caps in the UK, although really all eyes are on these nearer term targets down 2.5%, 3%. The DAX index is up just under 0.2% this morning, but again, it's looking pretty bearish. We've got downside targets activated of 3%. There's even one here of 11%, 8%. And 9.5%. So we're seeing lots of downside potential in the targets on the DAX, so still pretty worrying. The CAC 40 in Paris is up just under 1/3%, and again, still looking pretty bearish on all three time frames. Japan was down slightly overnight. That stronger yen having a bit of an impact on Japanese stocks, and we are bearish here on all three charts as well. So we're still continue to see falls in Japan. The Hang Seng bucked the trend a little bit, was up 0.2%, but the big fall last night was China, and we see China taking out that November low there on the short-term chart. We're coming back to test this October low by the looks of things, and viewers will know that I'm always very bearish on China. These downside targets hanging over us on the 1-minute chart here. We've got a lot of downside potential for the Chinese market. If we make new lows, that's really quite scary. So still a big worry, and lots of downside targets. When you see lots of downside targets like this really increases the probability of a fall happening. So still pretty bearish there. The Sensex in India was actually up 0.5%. It's looking better than most markets. It's bullish on the long term, bullish on the short term, and medium term just heading back into bullish territory. So it's the one market that's looking probably better than any other. The Aussie market's still looking pretty bearish on all three time frames. Lots of downside targets on that 60-minute chart. Now we're seeing here 5% downside, 6% downside, 5% downside, and again 4 or 5 targets to the downside. Notice how this previous target was given and met. That is quite worrying for the Aussie market. Taking a look at commodities, Brent crude is up this morning, weaker dollar helping here. Big falls yesterday, though. We see here on the chart we have a big downside candle, making new 14-month lows. Very similar picture to the stock market, in fact. And we've got downside potential of 3.8%, and a massive downside target, some 50% lower now, has been activated. But hard to imagine that right now. But not a good picture. Of course, we do head into the stronger quarter for crude next quarter, so we may see some respite. But at the moment, we're in a long-term bearish position. WTI really showing that. Further 4% downside here, and again, some massive downside targets around 50%. US nat gas recovered a little bit, sitting at $3.84. Unwound a lot of the rise that we saw in November last week, but we are now just recovering on the short-term chart. We've got an upside target of $4.14, so we may see a recovery there. Looking at gold, we are pushing higher on gold, above $1,250 for the first time really in months. We haven't really been at this level since July, so we are seeing gold pushing higher, and it's now looking like a very clear medium-term recovery. We've got upside targets 1257. That's not far now. 1302 is still sitting there, and we do have these big upside targets still here on the chart. They've been there for a very long time. Looking at silver, we're looking more bullish here as well. US 10-year yields are sinking to 2.82%. Of course, all eyes on that Federal Reserve decision. One key thing on the US 10-year 1% chart is the target to the upside above 4% has been negated. With the recent moves, we've actually undone that target. So that outlook for higher targets is less of a dead certainty of prices going much higher. So it will be very interesting to see how this chart reacts to the Federal Reserve today. All this data coming off Thomson Reuters Icon. If you're running Metastock, it's the same system, Metastock Zenith. So feeding into Updata, a really good data feed. On the stocks themselves, here we're using Yahoo Finance. This is free data coming into Updata. And first of all, we will take a quick look at the US market. We had Apple up 1.3%. No reverse in their relative chart to the Dow Jones. They've unwound very quickly at some 30% outperformance this year. So Apple was up, but not enough to really change anything. Alphabet was up 1.7%. Their relative chart actually just starting to improve relative to the market, so we're seeing a bit of an improvement. Long term, they're holding on. Amazon was up 2%, and again, their relative just starting to turn there as well. But we do have quite a lot of downside targets on that medium-term chart, but still looking very bullish long-term. Taking a look at some of the other stocks, we have Facebook. They were up 2.5%. Still an awful picture really in terms of the long and medium term. Seeing a little bit of a turnaround on the relative here as well. So Facebook have been performing better, which is quite key. Taking a look at Microsoft, they're up 1%. Their long-term uptrend still continues, and their relative chart is one of the best relative charts in tech at the moment versus the Dow. Now, taking a look at Netflix, we see they've been really just deteriorating slowly, and Tesla were down 3%. So their recent up performance is unwinding at the moment. Looking at the international indices, we see here a mixed picture. So we see most of the US indices were green, Europe's green up this morning, and Asia we had a mixed picture. The Nikkei and China down and Oz down, but the rest of markets were mostly up. So even we're seeing secondary markets like Jakarta, Taiwan, Singapore, they were all looking a little bit better. Taking a look at the Aussie market, we see here Regis Resources were up 6%, so they're looking a little bit better. We still do have some pretty big ones down. Bigger Cheese, for example, down 5.6, it's down 2%. So we've seen quite a lot of falls there as well. Taking a look at China, again, we saw China down over 1%. We only had about 7 stocks up on the Chinese market. In terms of fallers, we had some pretty big ones, down 4% with China Merchants Bank. So again, lots of downside targets, really replicating what we're seeing in the index. In Hong Kong, we had a mixed picture, some stocks up, some stocks down, mostly up. So we're seeing that just by scrolling through the list. In India, we had India Bulls Housing. This stock has really been one of the ones we see on the leaderboard or the laggard board each day. It's so volatile after these big falls. So it doesn't change the picture. Although we're up 6%, it's a really volatile picture. On the downside, we had HCL down 2%, and that's quite low. Here we see all the prices coming in from Yahoo Finance now. Taking a look at the Nikkei. The Nikkei was actually mixed again. So again, just a mixed picture there. So some stocks it picks down 7%, Cassia Electric down 5%. So we are still seeing some pretty big falls across the board. Looking to Europe now, so taking a look at the FTSE 100. So the just looking straight away at the leaderboard, we've got GlaxoSmithKline up this morning on their announcement of a joint venture with Pfizer. So they're looking pretty strong. The relative chart really has been relatively flat over the last year relative to the Dow Jones index. So Glaxo hasn't really performed that well. We do have a mixture of targets, but it's just a very choppy chart over the long term. GVC up 2.4% this morning, but that's a terrible looking chart. Bearish on the medium and long term, and Everaz we see here lower as well. Here we see prices coming in from Google Finance as well. National Grid up 1.2%, and if we look at the other end of the scale, we had Royal Mail down 2.9%, Randgold Resources down 2.3%, which is surprising given the rise in the gold price. But we see how the relative chart has gone from 40% underperformance at 60%, set to 100 this year against the Dow, moving all the way back to 100%. So we've seen that clawing back that performance. It's actually been one of the better performers over the last several months. So we are seeing here still quite a lot of fallers. Just Eat Group down a further 1% and looking pretty bearish there. Looking to mid caps in the UK, again just clicking on the percentage change, we see Dunelm Group up 4%, so that's quite impressive. One of the few retailers actually rising, but the chart is still pretty terrible. It's had a big fall. We're seeing on the relative chart, though, again, just that turning performance. This is the thing we want to start looking for any buying opportunities in the market. 888 Holdings not turning on their relative, that's for sure, and still looking pretty bearish there. Euro money down 3%, and again looking fairly bearish with downside targets. So quite key there as well. Taking a look at the other end of the scale, we've got energy and oil down 4%. They have been a strong performer though this year, outperforming the Dow by 30%. Interfan Holdings, they're down 2.7%, and into properties after big falls last week, still looking pretty grim. So we're seeing a lot of stocks, especially construction, the Weir Group, also just lower there, just testing new lows all the time, underperforming the market by 40% this year. So really have been some really terrible results. Looking last of all just at the European index, this is the Euro Stock 600. You'll find these lists in the libraries and Updata. We've got Scout 24 up 6%, Glaxo at the top there 5.7%. We already talked about them. Intesa up 5%. Quite a lot of the Italian banks are up. Unicredit Unicredit up 4%, and we're here. Banco at BPM, Mediobanca, all these Italian banks actually doing quite well this morning on news of the Italian government reaching a deal with the EU. So we are just seeing some respite there on the Italian banking sector. On the downside, we've got GAM Holdings down a further 5%. They've had a real terrible time this year, and Naxos in Paris down 5%. Deutsche Post down 5%. So we're seeing again some still pretty big falls, and here we see again the prices coming in from Yahoo Finance Live. So great for running into your Updata system. That's it for today. Until Monday, have a great weekend. Happy charting. See you then.